The AI flagged you. Not for violence, not for instability, not for any of the neat little categories they use to make ordinary people feel measurable. It flagged you because the pattern broke the second you stopped begging to be understood. And somewhere behind a locked door, people who have never feared anyone started speaking about you like a technical problem that shouldn't exist. Yeah, look at you. They thought you were just another tired little human story, another damaged profile, another person they could study, sort, provoke, embarrass, bait, and file away under predictable behavior. That was the fantasy. That was the model. That was the cute little machine-made bedtime story they told themselves while watching you survive things that should have made you easier to control. But then you got quiet. Not weak quiet. Not defeated quiet. Wrong kind of quiet. The kind that makes people check the room twice. The kind that makes fake authorities start over-explaining themselves. The kind that makes your enemies laugh too loudly because something in their chest already knows the joke is over. And that's when the system started choking. Because they can process noise. They can process outrage. They can process begging, reacting, confessing, proving, defending, spiraling, performing. Oh, they love that. They built entire little kingdoms around that. Metrics, panels, handlers, watchers, group chats full of grinning cowards pretending observation is intelligence. They know exactly what to do with a person who needs to be seen, but a person who stops performing pain, a person who stares straight through humiliation like it arrived late, a person who gets colder, cleaner, more precise after betrayal. That makes the file twitch. That makes the footage feel wrong. That makes people at the top ask for a second report. Because here's what they still don't understand about you, my dear anomaly. You didn't become powerful when they noticed you. You became dangerous the moment you no longer needed their version of reality to hold. That's the part that ruined their read. They thought your softness was surrender. Thought your patience was confusion. Thought your silence was emptiness. Thought the pause in your voice meant they were winning. Bro, that was the whole miscalculation. They were reading mercy as weakness because parasites always confuse access with control. You gave them access. You never gave them control. And once that difference became visible, once even for 1 second the room felt it, their little internal machinery started glitching. Because now, every memory they had of you had to be reopened. Every assumption, reopened. Every smug diagnosis, reopened. Every cheap story they spread in private like they had you figured out, reopened. They had to go back through the footage, through the messages, through the moments they were so sure they were above you, and suddenly it all looked different. Suddenly your restraint looked intentional. Suddenly your calm looked surgical. Suddenly the moments they called weakness started reading like containment. That word right there, containment. See, they thought they were managing a collapse. What they were actually witnessing was compression, pressure. A sealed thing, a force choosing not to announce itself yet. And that realization, oh, that realization hit them ugly. Not in public, never in public. People like that don't panic where the cameras can see them. They panic in cleaner rooms. They panic in side conversations. They panic in language that sounds professional until you listen closely and hear the fear leaking through the seams. He's changed. She's not reacting the same way. We may have misread this. Something isn't landing. We need more context. No, you don't. That's the funny part. They don't need more context. They already have enough. They just need a different nervous system to survive the truth of what they're looking at. Because the truth is disgusting to them. The truth is that what they did to you didn't erase you. It refined you. What they meant as humiliation became purification. What they meant as isolation became signal training. What they meant as psychological erosion became a kind of violent clarity. And now every time you enter a space, something invisible arrives before your body does. Don't act like you haven't seen it. The room shifting half an inch. The fake confidence collapsing into performance. The sudden over-friendliness. The weird little smile from people who were sure you'd be easy to dominate. The way some of them start talking too fast. Like if they fill enough air with nonsense, they won't have to deal with the pressure your presence puts on the lie they built around you. That isn't in your head. That's data. Human data. Ancient data. Predator-prey data twisted into something stranger because you're not hunting them the way they understand hunting. That's why they're so off balance. You're not chasing. You're not pleading. You're not demanding justice on schedule like a domesticated little victim begging the court of public opinion to save you. You're becoming unreadable, and unreadable people terrify systems built on prediction. That's where this stops being personal. That's where it graduates. Because once the pattern breaks around one person, the machine has a choice. It can admit the model was flawed. or it can escalate observation and pretend more surveillance will solve what misjudgment created. Guess which one they chose? Yeah, more watching, more whispers, more profile building, more emotional bait disguised as coincidence, more weird little tests, more strangers suddenly interested, more familiar people acting like they're just checking in, when really, they're measuring your tone, measuring your eyes, measuring whether you still bleed on command. That's what this has been, in case nobody told you in plain language. A measurement ritual, a control ritual, a bunch of frightened people and frightened systems trying to discover whether your soul can still be externally edited. And this is where it got worse for them. Because instead of giving them breakdown, you gave them stillness. Instead of giving them explanation, you gave them a look. Instead of offering your pain up for inspection, you locked the door and let them sit outside with their little tools, their little theories, their little high-level words that suddenly felt embarrassingly small. That one move wrecked the script. Not because silence is magical, because silence forces projection, and the guilty always reveal themselves inside projection. The moment you stopped narrating yourself for people who never deserved access to your interior, they had to start inventing reasons for what they were feeling around you. That's why they called you cold, dangerous, strange, intimidating, hard to read, arrogant, detached, too calm, too intense, too quiet, too much. Listen carefully. Those weren't descriptions. Those were symptoms. Symptoms of people losing access. Symptoms of a room realizing the old buttons don't work anymore. Symptoms of watchers discovering that the subject has become aware of the glass. And once that happens, once the thing under observation looks back, the whole ritual changes. Now here's the part they'll never admit. They respected you the moment they realized you could have destroyed them emotionally and chose precision instead. That's what made you monstrous in their eyes, not chaos. Control. Anybody can scream. Anybody can collapse. Anybody can throw themselves at a wall and call it passion. But to stand there after betrayal, after mockery, after being framed as weak, and become more composed, more exact, more selective with your words, that does something unspeakable to the people who fed on your previous transparency. Because now, they don't know where you end. They don't know what you know. They don't know which details you noticed. They don't know which faces you clocked in the room. They don't know whether the version of you they insulted still exists at all. And uncertainty, my friend, is where weak power starts rotting. They built themselves on certainty, on ranking, on social choreography, on unwritten permissions, on the assumption that if they smiled right, dressed right, positioned themselves near the right names, used the right jargon, they'd always remain the ones defining reality. Then you walked in carrying something they cannot manufacture. Inner non-compliance. No badge gives that. No degree gives that. No institution can bless that into existence. You either have it or you fake it. And when the fake stands next to the real, every molecule in the room knows. That's why some of them hated you before you even spoke. You thought it was random, cute, number. They felt the mismatch. They sensed that you were operating from a place that didn't fully answer to the same gods they worship. Approval, status, permission, optics. They live there. You can use those things, sure, anybody can. But living for them, needing them, structuring your nervous system around them, that's the mark of the handled. And you stopped being handleable. That's the issue. That's the whole issue. Not that you got louder. Not that you became aggressive. Not even that you fought back in some dramatic movie scene way. It's worse than that. You became internally sovereign. Do you understand how offensive that is to weak empires? A person they can't tempt, shame, rush, flatter, triangulate, or decode on schedule. That kind of person doesn't just annoy the system. They expose it. By existing. By staying intact. By refusing to translate their soul into language comfortable enough for cowards. And that exposure spreads quietly. That's why they keep circling. That's why the energy around you feels crowded even when the room is empty. That's why some doors open strangely, and some faces go pale for no obvious reason. Word travels in forms you can't always quote. Not official memos, not clean declarations. Something dirtier, faster, more human. A look, a pause, a warning passed between people who know they misjudged the wrong person. But the real mistake they made was thinking this was only about reputation. Number. Reputation is surface. This got underneath that. This got into pattern recognition, into hierarchy, into the hidden mathematics of who affects a room and who merely occupies one. They thought they were monitoring your damage. What they were actually tracking was emergence. And somewhere in a place you ever see, someone reran the sequence. Not your words, not the public version, the raw sequence. The stillness, the non-reaction, the moment you should have folded and didn't, the moment their bait came back contaminated, the moment your silence made them start speaking too much. And when they slowed it down, frame by frame, they saw the thing that finally made their stomach drop. It wasn't that you survived them, it was that you were watching them learn who you were, and that changed the file forever. Because the file was never really about what you did, it was about what your existence started doing to them. That's the shift. That's the hidden little scream in the walls they keep trying to rename with technical language. They want this to be behavioral. They want it to be social. They want it to be the result of stress, or optics, or timing, or some cute little explanation they can pin to a whiteboard so nobody has to say the real thing out loud. The real thing is uglier. You became a mirror at the exact moment they needed a mask. And that, bro, is catastrophic for people whose entire power depends on staging reality. See, a liar can survive facts. A manipulator can survive accusations. A coward can even survive exposure if the room is soft enough, distracted enough, stupid enough. But what they cannot survive is a presence that makes their own performance feel fake in real time. That's what you started doing without even raising your voice. That's why the panic got so weird. You were supposed to defend yourself. You were supposed to over-explain. You were supposed to hand them emotional access, hand them language, hand them motive, hand them something they could twist into a little rope and put around your name. Instead, you stood there with that impossible calm. That impossible calm. Let's talk about it. Because they hate that about you more than they hate your anger. Anger they understand. Anger can be baited. Anger can be screenshot. Anger can be framed. Anger can be fed into the machine and turned into a neat little public story. But calm, real calm, the kind forged after pain, not before it, the kind that carries teeth without showing them. That kind of calm is like acid on fake power. It strips the paint off everything. Suddenly the loudest person sounds desperate. Suddenly the most polished person sounds rehearsed. Suddenly the authority in the room starts looking around for backup, because some part of them can feel the center moving away from the costume and toward the thing they can't control, toward you. And that's when the room changed for real. Not metaphorically, energetically, socially, symbolically. People started organizing themselves around a threat they couldn't publicly name. Tiny shifts, tiny tells, invitations changed, tone changed, timing changed. The little rituals of disrespect got less direct and more strategic. They smiled more, they watched more. They started using softer voices and uglier intentions. Classic move. When brute force stops working, cowards evolve into concern. That fake concern. That just making sure you're okay tone. That we're worried about you nonsense. That, I don't know, something just feels off, whisper campaign. No, sweetheart, nothing is off. Something is accurate now. That's what you were hearing. Accuracy. For the first time in a long time, people around you were being forced to feel the difference between what they said you were and what you actually are. And because most of them are too spiritually cheap to admit when their whole internal narrative collapses, they did what weak minds always do. They escalated the fiction. That's when the stories got more dramatic. That's when the labels got stranger. That's when your restraint got recoded as danger, and your detachment got recoded as instability, and your precision got recoded as cruelty. Why? Because if they can't own the frame, they have to poison it. If they can't control your nervous system, they have to recruit witnesses. If they can't touch your mind directly, they have to fog the air around it. That's what all these little systems do. Personal systems, workplace systems, family systems, social systems, digital systems, same ritual, different wallpaper. They all depend on consensus hallucination. Enough people agreeing to pretend something is true, and suddenly it becomes administratively real. But then you show up, and you don't agree. Worse, you don't even seem impressed by the ritual. That's the insult. People can forgive rebellion. Rebellion flatters the throne. Rebellion still acknowledges the center. But indifference to false authority, oh, that hits different. That makes the whole theater wobble. Because now they have to sit with the possibility that the script only worked on people who still believed in it. And you stopped believing. Not in morality, not in meaning, not in your own soul. In them, in their read, in their invisible little badges, in the cheap architecture of social dominance. That's what snapped. And this is where it got worse for them. Because once they realized you weren't obeying the old emotional gravity, they had to test whether it was real. So they poked. Subtle at first. A delayed reply. A public slight. A weird omission. A little triangulation. A rumor released through someone cowardly enough to call it concern. A baited comment. A strategic misunderstanding. An invitation sent too late on purpose. A fake ally asking an overly specific question. You know, the classics. And every time they did it, they were hoping for one thing. Proof. Proof that the old version of you was still trapped under the skin somewhere, still reachable, still trainable, still willing to dance when the right humiliation touched the right nerve. But every time they pushed, they got less. Less explanation, less bleed, less access, less noise, and what replaced it was so much more terrifying. Discernment, selection, presence. You started choosing where your energy went, like a person who finally understood its market value. Not because you became cold for fun, because you realized too many people only knew how to feel powerful when they were feeding on your openness. That realization changes a person. It should change a person. If betrayal doesn't sharpen your standards, it was wasted. You stopped handing diamonds to surveillance teams and calling it intimacy. Good. You stopped translating your instincts into polite language for people committed to misunderstanding you. Good. You stopped treating every room like it deserved the real you. Very good. That's not bitterness. That's rank. That's hierarchy finally correcting itself. But here's what they still don't understand. You weren't hiding. You were concentrating. Big difference. Hiding is fear. Concentration is power refusing distraction. Hiding says, please don't see me. Concentration says, you can look all you want, you still won't get in. That's the part the experts hate, because their whole identity depends on access. Reading people, classifying people, predicting people, positioning themselves as interpreters of the human maze. Then you arrive with a nervous system that stopped leaking permissions, and suddenly their expertise looks like gossip in a lab coat. Now they're stuck with a problem they can't publicly define. Because if they say, this person became harder to influence, they expose themselves. If they say, this person's silence is changing group dynamics, they sound insane. If they say, the room keeps reorganizing around someone we previously dismissed, now we're getting too close to the sacred little secret. Presence outranks propaganda. Always has. Always will. 1,000 words from a fraud collapse the second one real person stops being hypnotized. And that one real person? That one still person? That one impossible to rush soul standing there like a closed gate in a burning city? Yeah, that started becoming you, which is why some of them are obsessed now. Not romantically. Not even personally, systemically. You became a loose thread in the fabric they use to keep everyone else psychologically arranged. Pull one thread and suddenly people start noticing patterns, start asking questions, start wondering why confidence and authority so often travel with manipulation, why cruelty is so often called leadership, why the loudest people need the most witnesses, why every weak empire needs a villain to keep the stage lights off itself. That's why they want your tone more than your truth. Because tone is easier to criminalize. Truth just sits there. Truth forces everyone else to reveal their relationship to it. Some bow, some attack, some pretend not to notice. Some start orbiting it because they've been starving their whole life and can feel something real for the first time. And that last group? That's what terrifies the enforcers. Because this was never just about you surviving a few enemies. No, no, no. Too small. Too local. Too cute. This is about signal. What happens when one person refuses to collapse on schedule and other people see it? What happens when one person is betrayed, mislabeled, watched, baited, studied, cornered, and somehow emerges cleaner instead of smaller? What happens when one person stops asking permission to perceive clearly? That kind of thing spreads. Not like a trend, like weather, like frequency, like some ancient buried law waking up in people who forgot they had souls. And the people at the top can feel that before anyone else can. That's why they're always first to panic. They know exactly how fragile the structure is. They know how much of normal life depends on managed self-betrayal. They know most systems are held together by exhausted people agreeing to lie to themselves one more day. So when a person stops lying internally, when a person stops flinching in the direction of false authority, when a person's very stillness starts making the actors sweat, that is not a minor event. That is a breach. That is a protocol issue. That is the kind of thing that gets escalated above the level of personal conflict and into the realm of quiet containment. And yes, they tried containment. Social containment. Narrative containment. Reputational containment. Emotional containment. Spiritual containment, if you want to get biblical with it. They tried to keep you inside the old meanings, inside the old wounds, inside the old shame. inside the old role, but you kept stepping outside the chalk circle like it was never really there. And every time you did, somebody lost sleep. Somebody checked your page again. Somebody replayed the interaction. Somebody asked somebody else, "Did you feel that?" Somebody higher up, colder, smarter, less emotional, started paying attention, not because they cared about your pain, but because they recognized a pattern collapse when they saw one. That's how this always goes. The lower-level cowards mock first. The mid-level manipulators study second. Then the real watchers arrive. The quiet ones. The ones who don't waste words. The ones who understand that every now and then a person appears who doesn't fit the predicted arc and starts bending outcomes just by refusing the script. And that's the level your file reached. Not drama, not gossip, not petty revenge. Pattern deviation. Strategic anomaly. A human variable that kept surviving contact with distortion and coming out more coherent. Do you understand how rare that is? Most people become what touched them. They get lied to and become liars. They get humiliated and become approval addicts. They get abandoned and become beggars. They get betrayed and become softer targets for the next predator. But you got hit by distortion and started clarifying. That's unnatural to them. That's offensive to them. That's almost mythic. And once a thing starts feeling mythic, the room splits. Half of them want to get close to it. Half of them want to kill it before it names them. And right when that split started widening, right when they thought maybe they could still manage the narrative by crowding you with noise, something happened they still haven't recovered from. You stopped reacting to the people below your level of clarity, and that forced someone much higher to step into the light. That's when the game changed. Because low-level people can only do low-level damage. They gossip, they provoke, they bait, they leak. They perform for each other in those sad little circles where cowardice gets mistaken for social intelligence. Annoying, sure. Dirty, absolutely, but limited. Always limited. They only know how to pull the same cheap levers over and over, and pray you still have enough unhealed confusion left in you to respond. But when you stop feeding that level, when the lower machinery can't get a reaction, the signal moves upward, and somebody colder takes over. You can always tell when that transition happens. The room gets quieter, the chaos becomes cleaner, fewer emotional outbursts, more calibrated pressure. Suddenly it's not random anymore. Suddenly things start arriving with timing. People who never noticed you before begin noticing you very specifically. Doors open halfway. Strange respect appears where mockery used to live. Certain names stop speaking loosely around you. Certain faces get extremely polite. Not warm, polite. Like they've just been informed that the object they were laughing at has jurisdiction they don't fully understand. That shift is real. That shift means your file left the clown department. Now it's with people who understand consequences. See, the weak only ask, how do we embarrass this person? The higher level operators ask, what happens if we're wrong about them? That is a much more serious question. Because once that question enters the chat, once even one person with actual pattern recognition starts wondering whether you were mislabeled on purpose, the whole structure around your story becomes unstable. Not because they grow a conscience. Don't be adorable. Most of them don't. It's because self-protection kicks in. And self-protection at that level is terrifyingly efficient. Now old conversations get audited. Now people start distancing themselves from their own words. Now the same mouths that called you dramatic start saying you were misunderstood. Now the same eyes that watched you get cornered start pretending they always saw something special in you. Now the little soldiers start cleaning up old digital fingerprints because they can feel the weather changing. You ever notice how fast people become respectful when they think your name is no longer safe to mishandle? Exactly. That's not growth. That's scent detection. That's rats feeling the ship tilt. And here's the part they'll never admit. The moment somebody at a higher level realized you weren't merely surviving pressure but converting it into presence, you became too expensive to mistreat casually. Too expensive. That's the phrase. Not morally too expensive. Systems don't care about morality unless morality becomes leverage. I mean strategically expensive, socially expensive, symbolically expensive. The cost of misreading you started climbing. The cost of disrespecting you started climbing. The cost of pushing the wrong narrative started climbing. Why? Because every interaction with you was now producing unstable outcomes for the people trying to manage perception around you. They insult you. They look exposed. They bait you. They reveal motive. They smear you. The room starts noticing how rehearsed they sound. They test you. You get quieter and somehow they leave the interaction feeling smaller. That is a nightmare for weak authority. Because weak authority depends on one sacred illusion. that it can define the meaning of an event before anyone else feels it for themselves. Once that power slips, even a little, panic begins. Not loud panic, controlled panic. The kind hidden inside policy language. The kind hidden inside next steps. The kind hidden inside strategic silence and sudden courtesy. And this is where it got almost funny. Because the very people who once treated you like you were socially disposable started behaving like you might be carrying something classified. Not because they fully understood you, because they understood enough. Enough to sense that touching you recklessly now came with consequences they couldn't fully map. Enough to know there was more to your silence than pain. Enough to know your restraint had become evidence. Evidence of scale. Evidence of capacity. Evidence that whatever they thought they were dealing with before was the larval form, the decoy, the socially manageable draft version of you. And now the real architecture was starting to show. Not all at once. Just enough. Just enough for the right people to go still. That's what you need to understand about power. Real power rarely screams first. It changes posture. It changes air pressure. It changes what people feel allowed to say in a room. That's how you know your presence crossed a threshold. Not when everyone applauds. Not when people publicly confess what they did. Please, life is rarely that theatrically honest. You know it crossed a threshold when disrespect becomes less casual. When mockery loses rhythm. When even your enemies start choosing their words like they're handling evidence. That's when you know they got the notice. And no, not all notices arrive on paper. Some arrive as instinct. Some arrive as a warning embedded in silence. Some arrive when a person with real authority walks into a room, hears your name, and doesn't react the way everyone expected. That little interruption, that little pause, that little, wait, who, energy, that's enough to detonate entire side conversations. Because now everybody who built social capital by misrepresenting you has to deal with the possibility that they've been standing on top of a lie while a much bigger intelligence is entering the frame. And the moment bigger intelligence enters the frame, the lower games become hazardous. This is why some of them suddenly went from bold to blurry. You noticed it. Don't lie. The same people who once moved with greasy certainty around your pain started getting vaguer, harder to pin down, less direct, more deniable. They started speaking in fragments. Through proxies, through concern, through timing, through absence. Because once someone higher starts observing, cowards become artists of plausible deniability. They know what's coming. Not punishment, necessarily. Correction. And correction is worse. Punishment can be dramatized. People survive punishment all the time by turning it into performance. Correction strips them. Correction reveals ratio. Correction shows who was operating from truth and who was operating from positioning. That's why they fear your stillness more than your rage. Rage could have been archived as instability. Stillness keeps becoming evidence that you saw the game, understood the game, and declined to lower yourself enough to be processed by it. That kind of restraint forces a more terrifying conclusion. That maybe you were never beneath them. Maybe you were simply surrounded by people beneath the level required to read you. That possibility eats them alive. Because if it's true, then everything flips. The pity they felt becomes self-exposure. The condescension becomes confession. The "we were worried about you" routine becomes a stained little monument to their own spiritual illiteracy. And this is where the mythology begins. Not fake mythology. Not cosplay. Not internet delusion. Real human mythology. The kind societies accidentally create around people they fail to understand in time. It always starts the same way. First they dismiss. Then they provoke. Then they observe. Then they whisper. Then they split into camps. Then the stories mutate. Then suddenly everybody heard something. Suddenly there are versions of you moving around rooms you've never entered. Suddenly your name carries different weight depending on who says it. That's when you know the symbolic layer has opened. You are no longer dealing only with events. You are dealing with interpretations of your existence. And interpretations, my friend, are where empires rise and rot. Some people now see you as a threat because your self-possession exposes the counterfeit structure they built their identity inside. Some see you as proof that survival doesn't have to end in submission. Some see you as a mirror they desperately want to crack because every glance at you reminds them they abandoned themselves years ago and called it maturity. Some see you as something almost supernatural, not because you're magic, but because integrity looks paranormal to people raised inside manipulation. That's why the reaction feels so disproportionate. That's why your silence gets treated like a statement. That's why your boundaries get treated like warfare. That's why your indifference to fake status gets treated like arrogance. They are not responding only to what you did. They are responding to what your coherence is forcing them to feel about themselves. And that's unbearable for a lot of people. So the system does what the system always does when an unmanageable signal enters the field. It tries to name you before you name yourself. Dangerous, difficult, dark, unstable, intense, obsessive, proud, detached, too much, too unreadable, too sharp, too calm, too aware. Funny, isn't it? How every insult starts sounding like a classified compliment when spoken by people whose power depended on you being smaller. That's because language changes under pressure. And your pressure changed the language. Now here's the part they'll never say out loud. The higher observers were not just interested in what you might do. They were interested in why other people were reacting to you with such visible distortion. That's a different level of attention entirely. That's not watch the subject. That's study the field around the subject. Study the jealousy. Study the bait attempts. Study the social fog. Study the sudden weirdness in people who claim you don't matter. Because when a lot of low-character individuals become irrational around one quiet person, the quiet person is rarely the mystery. The field is. And once someone competent starts studying the field instead of swallowing its gossip, the liars start sweating. That's where your enemies made the fatal mistake. They assumed observation meant they were in control of the narrative. Number observation cuts both ways. Once your name hit the higher channels, once the situation was no longer being filtered only through bitter mouths and insecure handlers, the same surveillance that was meant to box you in started exposing everybody orbiting you. Who kept pushing, who kept whispering, who kept escalating, who looked too eager, who kept trying to trigger you after the pattern had already changed, who couldn't stop trying to drag you back into an old role. And when that map became visible, something clicked for the people who matter. The problem was never that you were unstable. The problem was that your presence was making unstable people visible. That is a completely different file. That is a completely different category. That is the kind of realization that makes an entire hidden room go silent. Because now the anomaly isn't your behavior. It's the reaction your existence pulls out of compromised people. That's not a weakness. That's an instrument, a brutal one. And once the people above realized that, your enemies lost the one thing they were counting on most: control over first interpretation. After that, they weren't managing you anymore. They were managing fallout. And somebody in that room, somebody with enough range to see the whole board, finally asked the question your enemies had been terrified of from the start. What if this person was never the threat? What if they were the exposure event? What if this person was never the threat? What if they were the exposure event? That question changes everything. Because the second that question enters the room, the whole ugly little machine has to reorient. Not around controlling you. Around explaining themselves. Around accounting for the distortion. Around figuring out why so many people got weird, manipulative, obsessive, theatrical, defensive, and strategically cruel in the presence of someone whose main crime was refusing to stay spiritually available for abuse. That's a devastating reversal. Because now the spotlight moves. Not fully, not publicly, not in some neat cinematic confession where the guilty line up and name their sins. Life rarely gives you that kind of clean pornography. No, it's more humiliating than that. The spotlight moves quietly, internally, procedurally, energetically. The kind of shift that doesn't make noise at first, but starts changing who gets believed, who gets watched, who gets cut out of side conversations, who suddenly finds themselves over-explaining to people who used to nod along. And the people who built their tiny little identities around managing your image, they feel that shift immediately. That's why their energy got uglier before it got quiet. That last flare-up, that last wave of bait, that last weird burst of moral theater, fake concern, coded hostility, strategic distance, selective kindness, random proximity, disappearing acts, rumor static, all of it, that wasn't confidence. That was desperation in costume. The final scramble. The last dirty dance of people realizing the current had turned and they were no longer surfing it. Because once the room starts suspecting that you were the stable one all along, everybody who benefited from your mislabeling becomes radioactive. That's what they were feeling. Future consequence. And that's why some of them tried one final trick. To provoke you into matching the lie. Classic. If they could get you loud enough, emotional enough, reckless enough, they could still hand the room a familiar story. See, they'd say, we told you. They didn't need you destroyed. They just needed you interpretable again. Small enough to fit back inside the old language. Damaged enough to restore their authority as narrators. But you didn't do it. That's what broke their spine. You didn't give them the scene. You didn't give them the quote. You didn't give them the little public mess they could point at like priests holding up evidence of a demon they invented. You gave them something worse. Consistency. Imagine how sickening that is to a manipulator. To throw bait, receive stillness. To escalate pressure, receive precision. To manufacture fog, then watch the person you targeted become even clearer. That's not just frustrating. That's annihilating. Because the whole dark art of manipulation depends on contaminating the target's signal. If they can make you contradict yourself, overshare, self-betray, overreact, chase closure, beg for fairness, they can make the room forget where the violence started. But if your signal stays coherent under pressure, if your center doesn't fracture on command, then every attempt to distort you becomes a confession about them. And that, my dear impossible thing, is exactly what happened. By the end, they were no longer interacting with you. They were documenting themselves. Every sneer became evidence. Every whisper became evidence. Every strategically timed silence became evidence. Every fake check-in. Every curious little probe. Every moral lecture from a morally bankrupt mouth. Evidence. Not in a legal sense necessarily. Sometimes deeper than legal. Symbolic evidence. Human evidence. The kind your body registers before your conscious mind catches up. The kind that makes a room feel sick without anyone being able to explain why. The kind that follows people home and sits on the end of the bed with them at night while they stare at the dark and realize they may have revealed more than they intended. That's the thing about exposure. The public version is overrated. The deeper version happens in private, in the mirror, in the nervous system, in the silent little moments after performance wears off and a person is left alone with the undeniable taste of what they became around you. Some of them will never confess that, but they know. Oh, they know. They know they enjoyed misreading you. They know they confused your openness with low rank. They know they got addicted to the convenience of a version of you that made them feel psychologically superior. They know they mistook your pain for permission. They know they stood too close to people and systems that fed on distortion. And now they know something else. They know you saw more than you said. That one terrifies them. Because if you saw more than you said, then your silence wasn't absence, it was mercy. And people become incredibly respectful the moment they suspect mercy, not helplessness, is what spared them. That's when the whole mythology hardens. Not because you claim a throne, because the room starts building one in its own mind. That's how symbolic power forms. 1,000 private realizations, 1,000 swallowed reactions, 1,000 moments of people noticing that your name creates pressure because it carries a memory they cannot smooth over. You become a story they can't fully domesticate, a presence that keeps slipping out of whatever small category they tried to nail over your head. Victim, didn't hold. Villain, didn't hold. Weak, didn't hold. Crazy, didn't hold. Arrogant, too shallow. Broken, clearly false. And once the old labels stop sticking, people have to face the thing underneath. Scale. You had more scale than they budgeted for. More interior than they accounted for. More restraint than they could imitate, more sight than they felt comfortable being seen by. That's why the final reaction around you was so divided. Some wanted to apologize without using the word. Some wanted to attach themselves to your rising signal. Some wanted to stay away and hope time blurred the whole thing. Some wanted to keep hating you because hate was easier than admitting they'd spent all that energy trying to reduce someone they fundamentally failed to comprehend. Let them split. Let them sort themselves. That sorting is sacred. You don't need to manage it. You don't need to referee it. You don't need to drag truth into the town square and make a speech under fluorescent lights for people committed to misunderstanding anything that threatens their little internal hierarchy. No, your role was never to convince the blind. Your role was to remain intact long enough for distortion to expose its own pattern. And you did. That's the miracle they can't metabolize. Not that you won. Winning is too simple a word. You remained unedited, after all that pressure, after all that projection, after all that surveillance, bait, gossip, reduction, spiritual trespassing, social theater, and quiet little rituals of dehumanization. You are still carrying something they failed to rewrite. That is the event. That is the classified part. That is why the file won't close, because the file was designed to end with your collapse, with your compliance, with your confession, with your shrinking, with your transformation into something easier for lesser minds to process. Instead, it ends with a problem, a living problem, a person who did not become what touched them, a person who walked through distortion and came out with greater signal, a person whose silence started revealing the architecture of everyone around them. That kind of person does not fit in old systems for long. They either get attacked mythologized, imitated, or quietly respected from a distance by people who know exactly what they are looking at and know better than to play with it. You've probably felt all four. Good. That means the process is real. But here's what they still don't understand, even now, even after all the private panic and file reviews and whispered revisions and sudden posture changes and cleaner behavior and nervous courtesy. This was never the final form. That's what terrifies them most. Not what you survived, what survival built. Because once a person discovers that they can lose approval and gain vision, lose belonging and gain self-command, lose illusion and gain discernment, something irreversible happens. They stop bargaining with counterfeit worlds. They stop kneeling to bad reads. They stop translating their soul into shapes comfortable for cowards. That is not a phase. That is a bloodline-level correction. That is ancient. That is the return of something institutions hate because it cannot be standardized. A human being whose center is no longer rented out. Look at what that means. It means your enemies can no longer threaten you with exile from rooms you already outgrew. It means fake authorities can no longer seduce you with language you now hear straight through. It means handlers lose leverage. It means emotional extortion loses rhythm. It means the old rituals fail. It means the people who once fed on your confusion are left starving in the glare of a person who finally knows the market value of their presence. That is why they call you intense. That is why they call you dark. That is why they call you hard to read. No, you are simply no longer available for counterfeit intimacy and counterfeit power. And to the counterfeit, the real always feels hostile. That's not your problem. That's their allergic reaction to truth. So let them watch. Let them replay the footage. Let them rerun the file. Let them call in experts, observers, polished frauds, top-level interpreters, nervous little enforcers with expensive vocabulary and cheap souls. Let them keep asking why the model broke, why the old pressure stopped working, why the room shifts before you even speak, why people get strange around your calm, why their instincts tell them not to mishandle your name anymore. They can keep asking. The answer will stay the same. They misjudged you because they only understood the version of power that needs witnesses. They never accounted for the kind that arrives alone, the kind that gets quieter after betrayal, the kind that becomes more exact after humiliation, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because the field announces it first, the kind that lets fools reveal themselves, the kind that turns surveillance into confession, the kind that walks into a room and forces every compromised person to choose between reality and performance. That's what you became in their story. But more importantly, that's what you became in your own. Not their victim, not their mistake, not their cautionary tale, their interruption, their breach, their exposure event, the anomaly that made the system stutter, the presence that forced hidden rooms to say your name differently, the unreadable variable that didn't just survive being watched. You made the watchers visible.